If there is one thing that truly illustrates just how little evidence there is in the D.B. Cooper hijacking and just how desperate we amateur investigators are, it's the fact that many of us have done deep dives into these, the two matchbooks that Cooper had on the plane with him that day.
We don't know who he was, where he came from, or where he went.
Hi folks, it's Ryan Burns, and today I wanted to do a bit of a deep dive into the two matchbooks that Cooper had on the plane with him that day that were used to light his cigarettes. So it's widely believed in the Cooper community that the first of these two matchbooks came from the International Correspondence School, or ICS, which was a bit of a University of Phoenix sort of thing back in those days. One of the main ways that this company advertised was through matchbooks. These were ubiquitous. They put them everywhere. This was essentially like the America Online CDs if you were around in the 90s. You couldn't throw a rock without hitting an ICS matchbook. They were just ubiquitous. So Cooper having one of these isn't really that big of a deal and really doesn't tell us too much. The second matchbook was a blue Sky Chef matchbook. Sky Chef was a chain of restaurants that was found at the time in about a dozen American airports. Also, their parent company, Sky Chefs, was the main caterer for several airlines, including Northwest Orient. Our main source for this information is Tina Mucklow, of course, who was the poor stewardess that had to sit with this guy for about 5 hours in the back of the plane. She told the FBI a few days after the hijacking that she had to light several of his cigarettes for him because his right hand was continuously kept inside this alleged briefcase bomb. She said that at one point she ran out of matches from the first matchbook, which would have been this ICS matchbook. When she did so, she threw it in the trash. She put it in the seat pocket in front of her. Cooper stopped her. He says, "Hey, no, give that back to me." So she dug into the seat pocket and pulled out this empty ICS matchbook and handed it back to him. Interesting, but that's just kind of the kind of guy he was. He wanted all of his notes returned to him as well. But Cooper still had more cigarettes that needed smoking, so Tina said that he pulled out another matchbook, which was this blue Sky Chef matchbook, and that she used these to light more of his cigarettes. She tells the FBI that he retained this matchbook, so she must have given it back to him at some point before she left. One thing that is interesting about any discussion regarding these matchbooks is the fact that the ICS matchbook, this first matchbook that Cooper had, is not mentioned at all within the FBI files. In fact, there is no discussion anywhere about his first set of matches. All Tina mentioned to the FBI, or all they were interested in at least, was this second set, the one that he jumped out the plane with, the one that he was still using, the Sky Chef matches. And what's particularly interesting about this lack of ICS being in the FBI files as a modern investigator 53 years after the fact is that our main focus is to try to walk back Cooper, to trace him to somewhere, right? If we can say, oh, well, there was an International Correspondence School luncheon the day before in Spokane. Well, maybe he was at that, and maybe he got the matches there. Maybe he flew from another airport earlier that day and got these Sky Chef matches there, that sort of thing. We're backtracking. But it's kind of hard sometimes. We miss things as investigators. We miss the fact that this was, at the time, a manhunt. It was an active investigation. So I think it's more likely that the FBI, their mindset wasn't trying to get information about his matchbooks to backtrack him. It was in the present sense. Essentially, they wanted it in their files that he was still using Sky Chef matches when he jumped out. So, for example, you can think of some scenario where a couple met a strange guy at the Denny's the next morning who looked like Cooper, and they could say, oh, well, he had Sky Chef matches with him. Well, that would be a big clue that, hey, this possibly was Cooper. That sort of thing. I think that's really what the FBI's interest in the matchbooks were at the time, more so than us 53 years later using it to backtrack Cooper, essentially. Now, that's not to say that they weren't interested in backtracking Cooper with the matches. We do have in the FBI files where they're talking about researching Sky Chefs. They're like, hey, let's look at, let's try to talk to people who work at the restaurant there in Portland. And nobody remembered a guy like Cooper, because why would you remember Cooper? He was just a guy, right? So if this ICS matchbook is not anywhere within Tina's official statement to the FBI and isn't anywhere in the FBI files, well, then where does it come from? Well, it comes from Richard Tusaw's book, D.B. Cooper Wanted Dead or Alive, which came out in the early 80s. Tusaw is the only author to actually speak with Tina Mucklow in detail. He also spoke to every other member of the crew and to several of the passengers and other luminaries who were involved in the D.B. Cooper hijacking. So his sourcing is pretty dang good, and what he wrote in his book as far as the narrative of the events of the hijacking is generally considered to be reliable. And it is there where we get the ICS matchbooks. Well, she doesn't specifically say ICS, but she just says that the matches had earn a high school diploma, which this was probably almost certainly the ICS matchbooks. We also have a second primary source attesting to the ICS matchbooks, or the high school diploma matchbook, and that is co-pilot Bill Radicek. In 2013, he was giving a speech to the Northwest Airlines Museum there in Minneapolis, and he talked about this matchbook. He said that during the debriefing, which would have been his debriefing with the FBI, along with Tina Mucklow and the rest of the crew, that apparently Tina mentioned this matchbook having earned a high school diploma on it. Interesting that again, was not included in her 302 if he did, in fact, learn this during the debriefing. Why didn't the FBI write this down? Again, perhaps maybe they didn't care about that matchbook. Maybe they really only cared about the matchbook that he had when he left the plane and that he was still using.
And I said, in the debriefing, what was on the matches? Well, it said, how to get a high school diploma. Remember that?
As I said, Tusaw is generally considered to be reliable because he is writing this book with having done interviews with these people. And in his book, when he's describing these matchbooks and Cooper smoking and all this, he says that when Tina ran out of the ICS matches, that she went and got company matches out of a cabinet from behind Cooper's head. Now, this, of course, is totally different from what we have in the FBI files, where it says that Cooper had these. And this inconsistency about whether Cooper was given these Sky Chef matches or whether he had them when he walked onto the plane may seem inconsequential and trivial to most people, and it probably is, because it's probably not going to help us find Cooper. But it is important for dorks like myself to know these things. I would like to know what he had on him when he boarded the plane. But there are several reasons why I definitely tend to want to agree that these were Cooper's matches and not matches that he was given. Number one being that Cooper was a heavy smoker, so he definitely was going to be needing more matches than what he had. He ran out pretty quickly of the ICS matches, so it makes sense that he would have spare matchbooks with him as a heavy smoker. Also, doing this hijacking, I can think of other things that he would need matches for, landing in the woods, needing to start a fire, possibly stuff like that. So to think that he didn't have additional matches with him just seems kind of improbable to me. Number two is that I think it's always best when you're investigating things like this to go with the source that is closest to the event that you're investigating. So in this case, we have Tina Mucklow's statement to the FBI days after the hijacking. Then we have what she's telling Richard Tusaw 13, 14 years later. Surely what you say to somebody days after an event is going to be much more accurate than what you say to somebody 13, 14, 15 years later. That's just the truth. That's just the frailty of human memory. So though Tusaw's book is, like I said, generally pretty reliable, this is one of those things that I think there's enough evidence to suggest, and just common sense, that Cooper had additional matches with them and that Tina didn't have to go get up and get matches to give to Cooper that he then jumped out the plane with. It just makes sense that he had matches with him and that he would pull them out and give them to Tina and then get them back before he left. So I think that's how that played out. One final thing about these matchbooks that I do find quite amusing is that when you look at the ICS matchbooks from the late 60s and early 70s, the design that Cooper likely had with him, I think it's very humorous that, and somewhat ironic, that on the very front of the matchbooks it says, "Increase your earning power fast." Challenge accepted, said Mr. Cooper. Anyway, that's all I've got for today, folks. So like and subscribe and all that YouTube stuff, and I will talk to you guys again soon. Bye.